Scheduling Options General tab. This form is opened by selecting Tools Schedule Options. The Scheduling Options Form General tab has a number of options that users need to understand when progressing a schedule. Could you select Tools Schedule Options to open the Scheduling Options form, and we'll go through these now. Ignore relationships to and from other projects. Relationships may be created between two projects when either two or more projects are open together and you can create relationships in the normal way, or when using the Select Project option in the predecessor or successor form to create relationships to an unopened project. So checking this option will ignore relationships with other projects that are not currently open. So this does not work with relationships between projects that are open. Also, activities which have been imported with external early start and external late finish dates will have these constraints ignored when this option is checked, and we'll talk about the external early start and external late finish when we discuss importing and exporting an XCR file. Make open-ended activities critical. This option makes activities without a successor that would normally have float as critical, and this option makes the late dates equal to the early dates when an activity has no successor. Therefore, under normal circumstances, if you have a schedule with two activities here, as we've got here, this one here that doesn't have a successor will show float. So this is when open ends are not critical. If you mark it as open ends are critical, then this one here that doesn't have a successor, the early dates are made as the late dates, and this is critical. So where's this useful? So for example, this allows a user to display multiple critical paths in one project without the use of constraints. So if open ends are not critical, I can't see the critical path on both chains of events. But if I make open ends critical, I can see the critical path on both chains of events. This is quite useful if you've got a project that has separable parts and you need to show the critical path for each separable part. This can happen when you've got a large project such as a mine, which is the mine, the pit, the railway, the ship loading area, and you want a critical path for each. Or if you've got a hotel upgrade where each floor needs to have its own critical path. Use expected finish dates. This option turns on or off the expected finish constraints that have been signed against activities. An expected finish constraint is used to calculate the remaining duration for both unstarted and in-progress activities. You would not usually turn this off, and therefore if you have an expected finish constraint set, this is prior to rescheduling, where I have an expected finish date set of the 19th of July, but the schedule is currently showing the 12th of July, and then when I schedule, you'll see that with this expected finish constraint set, it increases the duration of the activity and recalculates the original and remaining duration. The history of this is that this allows an organization that's using timesheeting for people to enter an expected finish date in the timesheet, but allows the manager to turn off the expected finish date that's been submitted through the timesheets and to apply their own remaining duration to activities. Schedule automatically when a change affects dates. This is similar to automatic recalculation in other products like Microsoft Project. It therefore calculates the schedule whenever data that affects timing of the schedule is changed, such as if you change the duration of an activity or add relationships. P6 is a database product and is continually writing backwards and forwards to the database, and if you turn this on, the product can get quite slow. So I recommend that you leave scheduling automatically off, and when you need to reschedule, to press F9. Level resources during scheduling. Leveling delays activities till resources become available, and I don't recommend that you turn this option on ever. If you want to level the schedule, then I suggest that you use the leveling function. Recalculate assignment costs after scheduling. Primavera P6 allows you to have the rate of a resource change over time, so you can have a rate for this year and a rate for next year and a rate for the year after. So if activities get scheduled in future years, you increase the cost against the project. So a resource may be assigned different cost rates for different time periods. And you can see here that we have a resource that has one rate in this period, and then between this date and this date we have another rate, and between this date and this date we have another rate. So what this option allows you to do is to recalculate a cost rate when an activity is moved from one cost rate to another. So if an activity gets delayed into the future, it will recalculate the cost. If you don't have this ticked, then although the activity is moved into a new cost rate, the rate against the resource will not change. Retain logic and progress override. There are three options for calculating the finish date of the successor when the successor activity is started before the predecessor activity is finished. This option is applied to all activities in the schedule when it's calculated, and the next slides will explain how this function operates, and it's similar to Microsoft Project's split in progress function. So first of all, retain logic. In the example below, we have a relationship between the predecessor and the successor, and what's happening is that when we update the program, the predecessor and successor started at the same time, and therefore the remaining duration of this successor activity is delayed until the end of the predecessor. So the activity is split. You'll see that the critical path is maintained and the relation is critical, and there is no float on the predecessor or successor. Moving on, progress override. This is again a similar situation where you have a predecessor and a successor. They're both starting at the same time, and the remaining duration now is ignoring the predecessor activity. This is a non-driving relationship. This activity is continuous, it isn't split, and therefore gives you a less conservative schedule. Therefore, the relationship here is not driving, does not form part of the critical path, and the predecessor activity now has float. Let's move on and have a look at the actual dates. This function operates when there is an activity with an actual date in the future, and this is not logical. But with this option, what you'll see is when you have retained logic, here we have an activity in the future with a predecessor to this one, and this has been ignored. And with retained logic, you can see that this activity is split, and this relationship is a driving relationship. When we look at now progress override, what you'll see now is the remaining duration is on the data date, and both relationships have been ignored. If you move on and look at actual dates, what happens with the actual dates is that this actual relationship is being acknowledged, and therefore this is now a driving relationship and setting the start time for the activity here. It's not logical to have actual dates in the future, and therefore I can't see a point in time where you would ever use this option, but this is how the software works. I just wish to demonstrate retain logic and progress override. So if I select Tools, Schedule and Options, we can see here that we got retain logic and close, and if I schedule, you'll see that the chain of events all through the program has been maintained, although I have actual start and finish of an activity in the middle of the chain of events. If I select Tools, Schedule, Options, and I use Progress Override and close and schedule, I get a very, very different result. It is my opinion that you should always use retain logic, as the Tools, Schedule, Options here of retain logic and OK and schedule will always give you a more conservative schedule, and if you want to, you can change these relationships, but this will give you a date that is pushed out further than when using retain logic. Calculate start-to-start lag from. The successor of an activity with a start-to-start lag and a positive lag would start after the lag is expired. But when the predecessor commences out a sequence, the lag may be calculated from the predecessor's calculated remaining early start, which is the data date, or the actual start. So let's have a look at the pictures and explain this. So what we have here is the actual start, and therefore the lag here is calculated, which is a 10-day lag from the actual start. Whereas the early start gives a more conservative schedule where this lag is now being calculated from the data date. Define critical activities as. You have an option of total float less than or equal to 0, and therefore in this situation, if you have an activity is on a 7-day week and activity is on a 6-day week with a successor on a 5-day week, you'll find that this activity has 2 days float and this activity has 1 day float. and therefore you will lose the critical path in this environment. You have an option of selecting total float less than 1 day or longest path, and this will result in the software picking a chain of events that has the shortest amount of float, or a chain of events where the float is 1 day or less. I generally recommend that you select longest path for schedules that have multiple calendars, and the longest path is calculated by finding the chain of events with the least amount of float in it. Calculate the float based on the finish date of. This function is new to Primavera P6 version 6.2, and you can see that the float here, when we have multiple projects open, is calculated based on each individual project, and therefore this is where you're reviewing multiple projects where there isn't a relationship between the float on each project. Whereas if you select open projects, then this is like a sub-project functionality where the float of all the open projects is calculated to the last activity, and therefore you'd use open projects when each of these projects represents part of a contract or a project that you're executing, and use each project when you're reviewing multiple projects that don't have a dependency as far as the end date is concerned. Compute total float as. There are three options for the calculation of float on WBS and level of effort activities. There's the start float, which is the late start minus the early start, and therefore what you'll see here is that this activity here, which is a WBS summary, is calculating the float here based on the start activity. Or there's the finish float, which here you'll see the WBS here float is being based on the last activity. Or you can have the smallest of the start and the finish float. The interesting thing you'll see is that the float bar here is always drawn based on the finish float and not the start float. So if you do select the start float, you'll find that although the calculation here is based on the first activity, the float here is always drawn based on the finish float. So you can see that the total float bar only displays the finish float. Calendar for scheduling relationship lag. There are four options for the calculation of the lag. The example below shows the effect of changing the calendar on a 40-hour lag. So the predecessor activity is on a 24-hour-a-day calendar, the successor is on a 5-day-a-week calendar, and therefore you see a 40-hour lag will go from Monday afternoon through to sometime Wednesday morning. If we change the calendar to a successor activity, the 40-hour lag is calculated on 8-hour-a-day, 5-day-a-week. So we're finishing Monday afternoon, so this is the first day, second, third, fourth, fifth day. So in some circumstances, there can be a large difference in choosing between the predecessor and the successor. You'll find that Microsoft Project, by default, always calculates on the successor. But you find Primavera P6, when you create a project, normally by default it's on the predecessor activity. You also have options of 24-hour or project default calendar. It is my recommendation that all projects in one database should have the same calendar, and this avoids problems when you schedule multiple projects together, and I suggest that the predecessor calendar is a default and therefore should be used for all projects in a single database. But then this does bring around problems if you start importing Microsoft Project files into a P6 database, because this will come in as a default with successor. Scheduling Options General tab. Advice on options to select. The P6 default scheduling options are in general good, but you should consider changing the following options when the circumstances dictate. First of all, you need to select Make open-ended activities critical when you have the need for multiple critical paths. That's where you have a schedule where you want to show the critical path through different areas of the project. And secondly, you need to select Define critical activities as longest path when you have multiple calendars.